The Nexus Prime Combat Arena on Kepler Station had seen its share of bloodshed over the centuries, but nothing quite prepared the galaxy's elite for what was about to unfold on a rather mundane Tuesday afternoon. Well, mundane by galactic standards, which meant only 3 minor solar systems had collapsed that week, and the Andorian Trade Federation had nearly threatened to glass 2 planets instead of their usual 4. The arena itself was a monument to excess and poor taste, a crystalline dome that stretched 3 km across and rose like a metallic tumor from the station's hull. Inside, holographic advertisements, music for everything from plasma rifles to exotic pet insurance flickered against walls that could withstand the explosion of a small moon. The irony, of course, was that most of the violence contained within rarely required such robust construction. Most fights ended with someone getting their various appendages rearranged in ways that evolution had never intended, but the real entertainment value wasn't in the fighting itself. Oh no, that would be too simple for a galaxy that had perfected the art of turning music suffering into profit margins. The true spectacle lay in watching primitive species tear each other apart for the amusement of their supposed betters. It was like a nature documentary, except the animals were sentient, and the David Attenborough equivalent was a 3-headed Plutonian with a gambling addiction and questionable music personal hygiene. The current reigning champion was one Vixthara, a 4-armed Zephyrian whose species had evolved from something that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a nightmare, standing nearly 3 m tall on digitigrade legs that could crush titanium. Vixthara possessed the kind of natural weapons that made military contractors weep with envy. Each of her 4 arms ended in hands that could extend razor-sharp claws at will, and her exoskeleton could deflect most energy weapons as easily as human skin deflected harsh language. Her record spoke for itself: 847 music consecutive victories across 17 different combat formats. She had torn through opponents from 43 species, leaving behind a trail of dismembered limbs and shattered dreams. The betting houses had stopped accepting wages against her years ago, and even the most optimistic gamblers had learned to invest their credits in safer ventures, like black hole mining or teaching philosophy to military AI. The arena's current audience represented music, the cream of galactic society, which was to say they were rich, bored, and possessed the collective moral compass of a hungry piranha. Crystalline beams from the Helix Nebula rubbed shoulders, metaphorically speaking, with gas-based entities from the vortex systems. Music. The VIP boxes housed the real power players, corporate executives whose decisions could sterilize worlds, military commanders who collected planets like trading cards, and the occasional interdimensional tourist who had wandered in looking for the bathroom and decided to stay for the violence. The betting system was a marvel of technological advancement, music, and financial exploitation. Holographic displays showed odds that shifted in real time, responding to everything from atmospheric pressure to the contestants' breakfast choices. Sophisticated algorithms analyzed biometric data, combat histories, and even astrological compatibility to generate odds so precise they could predict the exact moment someone would start bleeding. Today's odds were particularly Entertaining. The Challenger, according to the displays, had roughly the same chance of victory as a snowball had of surviving a supernova. The betting computers had actually crashed twice, trying to calculate odds that small, eventually settling on displaying a simple infinity symbol with a sad face. Emoticon, but here was where things got interesting in the way that natural disasters were interesting to people who weren't currently being consumed by them. The Challenger wasn't some genetically modified super soldier or cybernetically enhanced killing machine. The Challenger wasn't even from a species known for producing competent music warriors. The Challenger was human. Now, humans had something of a reputation in certain circles, though it varied wildly, depending on whom you asked. To the Galactic Council, they were a barely civilized species that had only recently figured out faster than light travel and still occasionally tried to solve music disputes by hitting each other with sticks. To xenobiologists, they were a fascinating study in evolutionary contradictions, too weak to survive their own planet, yet somehow stubborn enough to spread across the galaxy anyway. To the entertainment industry, however, humans represented something far more valuable: comedy, music, gold. There was something deliciously absurd about watching creatures that had once been impressed by fire try to compete with species that had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe. It was like watching children play dress-up with their parents' clothes, except the clothes were power armor and the children occasionally exploded. The arenas management had acquired their human specimens through the usual channels: raids on frontier colonies, music, rescue operations that bore suspicious resemblance to kidnapping, and the occasional legitimate purchase from human criminal organizations who were happy to offload their more troublesome members. The legality was questionable, but then again, most of galactic civilization ran on questionable legality, held together by expensive lawyers and selective enforcement. Music arena regulations required that primitive species fight unenhanced, relying solely on their natural abilities. This was supposedly to maintain competitive balance, though everyone understood the real reason. Watching enhanced primitives win fights, music wouldn't be nearly as amusing as watching them lose in spectacular fashion. The current human had been sitting in the holding cells for 3 standard weeks, which was music unusual. Most humans either broke down completely within days or tried to escape within hours. And GT, music, and GT, this one had done neither. She simply sat, observed, and occasionally asked questions about arena protocols that seemed oddly specific for someone who was supposedly just another terrified primitive. The preliminary medical music scans had revealed the usual human physiology: laughably fragile bone structure, minimal natural armor, and reflexes. Music that were impressive only when compared to sedated gastropods. The psychological evaluation had been even less encouraging, noting high stress indicators and what the Zephyrian analyst had music described as aggressive resignation. What the scans and evaluations had music missed, of course, was everything that actually mattered. But then that was rather the point of the entire exercise, wasn't it? The galaxy's superior species had spent so long believing in their own superiority that they had forgotten to actually look at what they were supposedly superior to the arena's sound system crackled to life, drowning out the excited chatter of the crowd. With a voice that managed to sound simultaneously music, grandiose and bored, the announcer a hegemony construct that existed primarily as organized sound waves had been doing music this job for 2 centuries and had long since lost any enthusiasm for dramatic presentation, ladies, gentlemen, and assorted quantum entities. The voice boomed across the arena. Welcome to another edition of Primitive Combat Theater, where we prove once again that evolution is a ladder. Some species are still trying to figure out how to climb. The crowd's laughter rippled through the dome, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the dying gasps of small planets. In the red corner, weighing in at 400 kg of concentrated violence and terrible attitude, we have your reigning champion, Vexthara the Render, Slaughter Queen of the Zephyrian Empire, keeper of 847 consecutive victories and holder of the galactic record for most creative use of severed limbs in combat decoration. Vexthara emerged from her entrance tunnel music like a walking nightmare that had taken public speaking lessons. Her forearms spread wide gesture that was music, part intimidation display, part theatrical flourish, and part warning to anyone in the front rows who valued their internal organs in their current configuration. The crowd's roar of approval shook the arena's foundations, and music caused at least 3 minor tremors on the station's lower levels. And in the blue corner, the announcer continued, the enthusiasm draining from its voice like air from a punctured hull. We have today's sacrificial entertainment, a human female, age approximately 27, standard years, height 1.7 m, weight 63 kg, and possessing all the combat effectiveness of a mildly irritated houseplant. The crowd's laughter was less enthusiastic, this time tinged with the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to witness something that will either be briefly amusing or lastingly traumatic. Kira Blackwood stepped into the arena with the kind of calm that made experienced observers suddenly check their life insurance policy. She was exactly as unremarkable as the scans had suggested. Average height for a human, lean build. That spoke of regular exercise rather than enhancement, and features that would blend into any crowd on any human colony world. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes swept the arena with the kind of systematic attention that suggested she was music, cataloging exits rather than admiring the architecture. She wore the standard arena jumpsuit, a garment designed to provide minimal protection while maximum visibility for whatever violence was about to unfold. No weapons, no armor, no enhancement visible to the naked eye or sophisticated scanning equipment. Just a human being standing in an arena designed to showcase the superiority of species that had conquered the stars, while her own kind was still learning to make fire reliably. The crowd's betting frenzy reached new heights as Kira entered the combat music zone. Holographic displays showed odds shifting so rapidly they became abstract art, with most bets concentrating on how quickly Vexthara would end the fight and exactly how many pieces the human would be in when it was over. What none of them noticed, of course, was the way Kira's eyes tracked the arena's energy patterns, mapping the power conduits that fed the containment barriers. They missed how she tested her footing, not for grip but for structural integrity. Music of the floor plating. They certainly didn't catch the micro-expressions that crossed her face. Music as she analyzed Vexthara's stance, movement patterns, and the barely perceptible hesitation that suggested overconfidence. Music. But then superior species had never been particularly good at noticing details that didn't fit their preconceptions. The referee, a floating crystal entity that existed primarily to ensure the violence remained within acceptable parameters, activated the combat field. Energy barriers shimmered to life around the fighting area, containing anything short of a nuclear explosion while providing the audience with perfect visibility for whatever carnage was about to unfold. Combatants, the referee announced in a voice like wind. Music chimes made of broken dreams. You will fight until one of you can no longer continue, one of you yields, or one of you dies. Arena regulations prohibit the use of external weapons, but natural biological weapons are encouraged. Betting closes in 30 seconds. Vexthara began her pre-combat ritual, a display of stretching and posturing that served both as intimidation and warm-up exercise. Her forearms moved through complex patterns, while her claws extended and retracted with the precise timing of a well-maintained machine. Each movement was calculated to demonstrate her superior reach, strength, and the numerous ways she could separate a human into component parts. Kira simply stood and watched. Her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady. She looked like someone waiting for public transportation rather than someone about to face nearly half a ton of genetically perfected killing machine. The final betting tallies flashed across the arena's displays. Music. 99.7% of all wages favored Vexthara, with victory projections ranging from 15 seconds to 2 minutes. The remaining 0.3% of bets favoring the human were generally assumed to be either data input errors or the result of severe head trauma among the betting public. Final betting has closed, the referee announced. Combatants prepare for engagement. Vexthara dropped into a combat crouch that made her look like a metallic spider preparing to pounce. Her mandibles clicked with anticipation, and the tip of her tail, which ended in a barbed stinger capable of punching through ceramic armor, swayed like a pendulum counting down to destruction. Kira took a single step forward and raised her hands in what might generously be called a fighting stance. To experienced observers, it looked like someone who had perhaps seen violence in movies and was trying to recreate it from memory. Begin combat, the referee declared. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Vexthara circled slowly, savoring the moment while Kira turned to keep her opponent in sight. The crowd grew restless, expecting immediate violence but getting what looked more like an awkward dance between species that had never learned proper choreography. Then Vexthara made her move, and it became clear why she had held the championship for so long. She didn't attack so much as explode into motion, covering the distance between herself and Kira in a blur of limbs and claws that turned the air itself into a weapon. Her strategy was simple: close distance, overwhelm with superior reach, music, and strength, and end the fight before the human could do anything. Embarrassing, like survive longer than expected. It might have worked too if Vixthara hadn't decided to add insult to inevitable injury. Instead of going for an immediate kill, she pulled her strike at the last moment, letting only one hand connect with Kira's face in what was meant to be a dismissive slap. The blow had enough force behind it to send a human flying across the arena, but it was delivered with the casual contempt of someone swatting an insect. The crowd erupted in delighted laughter as Kira sailed through the air and struck the arena wall with a sound like a bag of wet cement hitting pavement. She slid down the wall and lay motionless for a moment while Vixthara turned to acknowledge the crowd's appreciation for her theatrical cruelty. Such artistry, the announcer declared. Such refined technique, Vixthara demonstrates why she remains champion by turning violence into performance art. Vixthara raised all forearms in victory, her mandibles clicking in what passed for Zephyrian laughter. The crowd's approval washed over her like warm rain, and several dozen species that had never agreed on anything else found common ground in their appreciation for superior beings putting inferior ones in their proper place, which was when Kira Blackwood opened her eyes, smiled, and began her 3-second countdown to victory. Second 1 assessment. As Kira pushed herself upright, her military training kicked in with the efficiency of a well-maintained machine. Lieutenant Kira Blackwood, formerly of the Earth Special Music Forces 23rd Reconnaissance Division, had spent 8 years learning how to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than she was. The fact that those things had usually been human didn't make the principles any less applicable. Vixthara was strong, fast, and supremely confident. She was also, as of this moment, completely focused on the crowd and utterly convinced that her opponent was no longer a threat. Classic mistake. Number 1. Assuming your enemy is defeated until you've confirmed they're actually dead. The arena's power grid was running standard music containment protocols, which meant the energy barriers were drawing from the primary fusion generators through relay nodes positioned at regular intervals around the fighting area. Classic mistake. Number 2. Assuming that primitive species couldn't recognize advanced technology just because they hadn't invented it themselves. Second 2. Positioning. Kira rose to her feet with movements that looked like someone struggling to recover from a devastating blow when they were actually someone with 8 years of combat experience. Getting into optimal striking position, she had landed exactly where she needed to be, directly adjacent to one of the power relay nodes with a clear line of sight to Vixthara, who was still playing to the crowd. The Zephyrian champion was standing in the center of the arena, all forearms raised, completely exposed and utterly convinced of her own invincibility. She had made the same mistake that had ended the careers of hundreds of fighters before her. She had confused winning with music, having already won. Kira's hands moved to the small of her back, where the arena jumpsuit had a decorative seam that looked like standard clothing construction but was actually something else entirely. The medical scanners had detected human DNA, human bone density, human muscle fiber composition. They had not detected the ceramic knife that had been surgically implanted beneath synthetic skin grafts, or the small explosive charges that were chemically identical to human adipose tissue. After all, who would bother to scan for advanced weapons technology in a primitive species that had barely Mastered fire, second 3 execution. The ceramic blade came free with practiced ease, its edge honed to a molecular level and coated with a polymer that would conduct electrical current better than most metals. Kira drove it into the power relay node with surgical precision, creating a feedback loop that the arena safety systems were never designed to handle. Simultaneously, she triggered the small explosive charges that had been masquerading music as body fat, not to damn it herself but to create a specific resonance frequency that would amplify the electrical feedback she had just initiated. The explosion was barely large enough to be noticeable, just sufficient to turn her body into a living tuning fork that broadcast the relay node's destabilizing frequency directly into the arena's power grid. The result was something that would later be described in engineering reports as a cascading music systems failure of unprecedented elegance and devastating effectiveness. The containment barriers didn't just fail. They inverted, creating a localized gravity well that pulled everything in the arena toward the center with the force of a small planet, Vexthara, who had been basking in the crowd's adulation, suddenly found herself being dragged toward the arena floor by forces that her exoskeleton was never designed to handle. The gravity inversion lasted exactly 2.7 seconds before the arena's emergency systems managed to shut down the primary power grid. In those 2.7 seconds, Vexthara experienced gravitational forces equivalent to standing on the surface of a neutron star while wearing an anchor for formal wear. Her exoskeleton, which could deflect energy weapons and crush titanium, proved remarkably vulnerable to being compressed by its own augmented mass. The sound it made was like a very large nutcracker being operated by someone with serious anger management issues. When the emergency lighting came up and the dust settled, the arena was silent except for the sound of various life support systems struggling to restart. Vexthara lay in the center of the fighting area in a configuration that would have been anatomically impossible for any species that hadn't just experienced selective gravitational liquidation. Kira Blackwood stood where she had been when the chaos started, looking slightly disheveled but otherwise unharmed. The ceramic knife had vaporized in the electrical feedback. The explosive charges had been consumed in their own detonation, and any evidence of technological enhancement had been erased by the very process that had ended the fight. To external observation, it looked like the arena systems had catastrophically malfunctioned at the exact moment that a primitive human had somehow survived what should have been a fatal blow. The timing was suspicious, but the mechanism was impossible to explain without assuming capabilities that contradicted everything the galaxy knew about human technological development. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before music. Someone in the crowd managed to form coherent words. What said a crystalline entity whose species had mastered quantum mechanics before humans had figured out agriculture just happened. The announcer's voice, when it finally returned, had lost all of its previous confidence and most of its structural cohesions. Ladies and gentlemen, it managed to reappear to have experienced a technical difficulty. The other champion appears to be redistributed, and the human appears to be not dead. The crowd's response was the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for moments when they fundamental laws of physics decided to take an unscheduled coffee break. Kira looked around the arena, her expression perfectly neutral, and spoke for the first time since entering the combat music area. "I believe," she said in the tone of someone commenting on the weather, "that your champion has forfeited." The referee, whose existence as organized crystal patterns had been temporarily disrupted by the gravitational anomaly, managed to reconstitute enough coherence to make an official ruling. "Victory," it announced, with the enthusiasm of someone ordering music, their own execution to the human challenger. The betting system, which had been calculating payouts for Vexthara's victory with the confidence of mathematical certainty, suddenly found itself facing odds that existed primarily in theoretical mathematics. The computers crashed immediately, taking the station's economy with them, and causing at least 17 different currency exchanges to briefly question the nature of reality itself. In the VIP boxes, beings that commanded interstellar empires and controlled the flow of galactic commerce sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Several of them were quietly reassessing their species policies regarding human territorial expansion, while others were wondering if they had been fundamentally wrong about the nature of primitive civilizations. The aftermath of that Tuesday afternoon fight rippled through galactic society like a stone thrown into a pond full of gasoline and existential dread. Within hours, human stock in the gladiatorial markets had increased by approximately 3,000%, while demand for Zyphorian fighters had mysteriously evaporated. Arena officials spent weeks investigating the system failure, but their reports only raised more questions. The power grid malfunction had been caused by a feedback loop that required precise technical music knowledge to trigger, yet there was no evidence that the human possessed such knowledge. The timing had been perfect, yet the mechanism appeared to be accidental. The official conclusion was that Vexthara had been the victim of an incredibly unlikely coincidence systems failure that had occurred at the exact moment she was about to finish off her opponent. The unofficial conclusion, whispered in the corridors of power across the galaxy, was that someone had seriously underestimated the species they were using for entertainment. Within a month, 3 separate species had filed formal complaints with the Galactic Athletics Commission, claiming that humans were using unfair tactics that violated the spirit of primitive species combat. The complaints were rejected on the grounds that there was no evidence of technological enhancement, but the message was clear. The galaxy's superior species was starting to feel less superior. Human territories, which had been largely ignored by the major powers as backwater colonies of no strategic importance, suddenly found themselves receiving diplomatic inquiries from civilizations that had previously refused to acknowledge their existence. Trade agreements that had been stalled for decades were suddenly fast-tracked through bureaucratic channels that had never shown such efficiency before. Kira Blackwood found herself transferred from the arena's holding cells to what music, the management euphemistically called enhanced accommodations, which included actual furniture, food that didn't require a translator to identify, and access to educational materials about galactic civilization. She was also informed that her contract had been renegotiated to include profit-sharing arrangements and performance bonuses. She accepted these improvements with the same neutral expression she had worn throughout the fight, occasionally asking questions about arena protocols that continued to seem oddly specific for someone who was supposedly just learning about advanced technology. Other human fighters in the galactic combat circuit suddenly found their odds improving and their treatment becoming considerably more respectful. Arena managers who had previously viewed humans as expendable entertainment began investing in music, training programs, and support staff, while bookmakers started offering insurance policies against unusual technical difficulties during human matches. The Zyphorian Empire, meanwhile, quietly withdrew from the gladiatorial entertainment music industry and began focusing their attention on military applications where the chances of gravitational inversion were considerably lower. Vexthara's fate was officially music, listed as combat-related structural redistribution, which became the standard euphemism for what happened when someone made the mistake of underestimating their opponent. As weeks turned to months, the galactic entertainment industry adapted to its new reality with the kind of creative accounting that had made civilization possible in the first place. Human fighters were reclassified from primitive species to emerging competitors with betting odds that acknowledged the possibility that they might occasionally win fights against supposedly superior opponents. The arena on Kepler Station continued to host combat events, but the management quietly installed additional safety systems, music, and hired consultants specializing in unusual technical phenomena. The power grid was redesigned with redundant safeguards against music feedback loops, gravity inversions, and what the engineers described as statistically improbable coincidences. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy's various species viewed the concept of primitive civilizations. The comfortable assumption that technological advancement correlated directly with combat effectiveness had been shattered by 2.7 seconds of applied physics and creative problem solving. Military academies across the galaxy began adding courses on music, asymmetric combat scenarios, and technological disadvantage compensation. Strategic planning departments started including sections on primitive species, variables in their threat assessments, and somewhere in the classified archives of a dozen different intelligence agencies, analysts were quietly updating their files on human capabilities and wondering what other primitive species might be full of surprises. The irony, of course, was that none of them learned the real lesson. They had created the situation themselves by assuming that superiority meant safety, that advanced technology guaranteed victory, and that being primitive meant being helpless. They had built an entire entertainment industry around watching the weak be destroyed by the strong, never considering that weakness and strength might be more complex concepts than these civilizations wanted to acknowledge. Kira Blackwood continued to fight in the arena, winning matches with a combination of careful preparation, tactical thinking, and an impressive talent for finding creative solutions to impossible problems. She never lost another fight, though she did occasionally experience what officials described as music mechanical difficulties that always seemed to favor her position. She also never explained how a supposedly primitive human had managed to trigger a cascading system's failure with surgical precision, or why someone who had allegedly never seen advanced technology before seemed to understand arena protocols better than some of the engineers who had designed them. But then the galaxy's superior species had never been particularly good at asking the right questions. They were too busy being superior to notice that the primitive species they were using for entertainment might have been studying them just as carefully as they were being studied. And so the great wheel of galactic civilization continued, music to turn, powered by the same arrogance and assumptions that had made it possible for a human girl to end a fight in 3 seconds by using music, her opponent's own superiority against them. After all, the best teachers are often the ones who don't realize they're teaching, and the best students are frequently the ones who never let on exactly how much they've learned.